Prepare yourself for tales of the creepy, the terrible, and the awful things that hide in the night. Welcome to these dark spaces. The Fifth Horseman. Amanda had screamed the first time it happened. Thousands of birds were suddenly falling from the sky, dark masses screeching in unison, writhing in pain as they plummeted towards the earth. They'd smashed into the ground all around her, each making a sickening thud as they struck, their mangled bodies littering the ground in various states of disfigurement. Some had come down with so much velocity that they weren't much more than a pile of feathers. Others had only broken their neck. Their heads were turned at unnatural angles, their dark eyes seeming to stare directly into her soul. But then they were gone. All of them. Not a single feather was left. That was her first vision. She'd wondered if she was going crazy, if somehow the mental illness that had overtaken her mother and turned her into a shell of what she once was now surfacing in her. She'd gone to the doctor, explained what she'd seen, but they just dismissed it as a sort of waking dream, a fantasy manufactured by her mind. But she knew what she saw. She just couldn't explain it. Then came the second vision, more terrible than the first. During a walk on a particularly bright sunny day, a luxury in the Seattle area, she'd stopped to admire the view over the bay when the earth began to tremble around her. At first, she only felt a small hum of vibration just strong enough to be felt through the soles of her shoes, but it soon grew loud and pounding, slow and rhythmic, and increasing in speed and volume until it was a loud roar, causing her to put her hands over her ears, her eyes watering in pain. All around her, it seemed like no one else heard it. All of them were just going about their lives like nothing was even remotely out of the ordinary. Then the chasm opened, a large, fierce gash in the ground, glowing with anger from deep below. And the people around her, the ones who didn't seem to see anything, began to fall in. She could hear their screams as they plummeted to their deaths, a sickening sizzle of human flesh as they were consumed by the fire burning in the cavernous expanse below. She could feel the heat of it on her skin, almost as if she herself had been cast in. At first, it was just a handful of people around her, those that had also been out for a walk or a jog, but soon, as if launched by some unseen force, hundreds came to be consumed by the pit, disappearing into the open maw of this gash in the earth. The angry maw of the trench grew in fits and spurts, as if the more human flesh it consumed, the more anger and power it gained. The stream of people being thrust into the pit grew faster and faster, until it seemed as if the whole of humanity was being consumed by its insatiable hunger for more. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished without a trace. The roaring suddenly stopped and the earth had instantly healed itself. Not a sign of the chasm nor any of the lives it had consumed to be found. There she stood in the middle of the park, by the calm waters of the bay once again, and she speculated about her own sanity. She skipped the trip to the doctor this time, fully expecting her to say that it was just another dream and that she shouldn't worry too much about it. Yet. Things settled down for a while after that, and no more visions came Amanda's way. She even started to think that maybe the doctor was right. that it had all been some kind of series of weird dreams she'd gotten mixed into her reality. She'd even gotten back into her normal routine, making it through the workday without too many problems, then to the gym after, and finally home to relax. She hadn't been much on dating lately, especially with her situation. So most of her nights were spent alone, unless one of her friends called her and coaxed her out for an evening of what usually ended up with entirely too many drinks had by all. But that hadn't happened for a while. She'd sort of had a falling out with the group. You definitely find out who your real friends are when you make a few poor life choices. Okay, more than a few. She ran a finger along the scar he'd left her with on her arm and touched her cheek, remembering the white, hot pain radiating when he struck her. At first, her friends tried to help, but Amanda had tried to convince them that he didn't mean it, or it was an accident. It made her sad to think about it now. How if she just accepted their help, she likely wouldn't be where she was now, alone in her apartment, wallowing in the past. And if that wasn't bad enough, her friends had distanced themselves even more when she had told them about her visions. Thinking back, she really wished she hadn't used the word visions to describe them. It made them sound like the rantings of a lunatic or some religious extremist. But it was too late now. She'd become a sort of sometimes friend that they'd invite when a large group was going out, mostly out of pity. She usually ended up declining, knowing exactly what it was. Most nights she was here, sitting on her couch with her dinner in her lap, wasting her time by watching the same cheesy sitcoms and sci-fi shows that she'd already watched what seemed like hundreds of times, until her eyes drooped and her body begged for sleep. A few months had passed since her last vision. Missing her friends, she decided that it was time to reconnect. She texted them in the group chat they'd all used and found out they were planning on going to a bar just down the street from her apartment. She asked if they wouldn't mind her dropping by just to say hi. Her message sat on read for a minute before they agreed and gave her the address. Nervous, she'd even went home from work a little early to get ready, wanting to make sure everything was just right. The time came and she left her apartment with a lightness to her step, thinking that maybe this could be a new start, re-emerging after all this time, back into the social butterfly she was. Despite the uncomfortable high-heeled shoes she'd chosen already starting to form blisters on her heels, she made it to the bar slightly earlier than the rest of the group. She found an empty chair at the bar and waited, sipping on something fruity the bartender had recommended, the alcohol instantly relaxing her. Each time the door opened, she glanced over, hoping it was her group of friends. Finally, the door opened and the sound of loud laughter poured in from the outside on the street. Her friends almost careened through the door, clearly already having had a few drinks. She stood and waved with a broad smile on her face. And then the screaming started. Amanda looked on in horror as the entirety of the club's patrons fell, many dropping immediately to the floor. As she watched, the flesh of every person, even her friends, began to melt away from their bodies in large, viscous chunks. It oozed and dripped down to the floor, landing with a wet smack on the hard concrete floor of the bar. She watched in horror as muscle and sinew and even bone began to show through on what only moments ago were the faces of each of her friends. The screaming was deafening, and the people began clawing at their own skin, ripping off what hadn't already fallen to the floor, revealing angry red muscle and tendons underneath. Writhing in pain, their flesh piled around them in sick, reddish pools. It was all Amanda could do to not throw up the small amount of food in her stomach that she'd had before she left her apartment. She turned away, gagging, feeling the bile rise in her throat as she leaned against the bar, head in her hands. And then the screaming suddenly stopped. Amanda opened her eyes at the sudden silence and lifted her head, quickly looking around, fully expecting there to be no melting flesh, no protruding bone, no bodies at all. But there they were, all of them, suddenly silenced by death, and already in various states of decay. Whatever had happened to them seemed to have spared their internal organs, though, and next to each of the bodies was a mass of entrails, spilled on the floor and glistening, reflecting the lights still flashing in the club. The vomit rose in her throat again, and dashing to the nearest trash can, she threw up the small amount of food in her stomach, heaving even after her stomach was empty. A hand on her shoulder snapped her back to reality. One of her friends stood there, a worried look on her face. Her completely whole face. "Are you okay?" she yelled close to Amanda's ear so as to be heard over the thumping beat of the current song. Amanda looked around, paused, and nodded, following her friend's guidance to a nearby table. Amanda shook, her mind still reeling from what she'd seen. Or had she? It had to have been another vision, that much she was sure of, but it was so much more intense than the previous ones. She'd even been able to smell the flesh as it had melted from their bodies, a hot, sick smell, like beef on a grill, charring as the flames licked it from underneath. Amanda nodded shakily, still in a bit of shock. After collecting herself for a moment, she leaned in close to her friend's ear, yelling over the music.
"I think I'm just gonna go home."
Her friend nodded, took her hand, and walked Amanda back to the door, the rest of the group watching. They both stepped out into the cool night air, her friend once more checking to make sure Amanda would be okay. Amanda nodded, assuring her she was fine. Her friend waved and went back inside. Amanda then began the short walk back to her apartment, still trembling, climbed the 2 flights of stairs wearily, and practically fell into bed once she was back inside, only managing to kick off her shoes before exhaustion took over. The next morning she awoke with a start. The images of the night before were flashing in her dreams. The screams. Oh God, the screams. She took a deep breath, tried to clear her mind, and climbed out of bed, pulling on some clothes to head down to the coffee shop downstairs for her usual latte, hoping a bit of routine would help. She ordered, sat down, and the coffee was soon dropped off, the steam rising from the cup, dancing in the air before dissipating. The morning was cooler than expected, unseasonably cold for this time of year. She shivered, wishing she had brought a jacket along with her to help repel the cool morning air. She put the cup to her lips, relishing the warmth against her palms, ready to take her first sip, when the man sat down across from her at the small 2-person table. She hadn't even seen him advance on the table. He was just suddenly there and swiftly sitting down. The lapels of his worn brown jacket turned up, and black baseball cap atop his head casting deep shadows that obscured portions of his face. But his eyes, those she could see clearly. Those almost yellow eyes that seemed to glow even in the morning sun. Startled, Amanda had begun to stand to get away from this intrusion that had assaulted her personal space. But before she could, The man reached out with a pale hand marked with burns and scars and took hers. His hand was warm, a little too warm, but there was something almost calming about it. The heat radiated up from her hand clasped in his, slowly spreading to the rest of her body, relaxing her. But there was also a hint of something else that tickled the back of her mind. Something she could sense burning deep inside, just waiting to come out. Her eyes darted back to his, and she slowly sat back down as he released her hand.
There now.
The man rasped.
That's better. There's no need to be upset. I'm not going to hurt you. Unless, that is, you decide you want me to,
he said with no malice in his voice. The calm was still washing over Amanda, so she didn't quite notice the last part of his statement. Instead, she looked over at him, her eyes drooping, and just smiled.
Now,
he started.
Let me begin by introducing myself. You may call me Victor, but that is not my actual name.
The tranquil feeling had already begun to fade, however, and Amanda's senses returned to normal. Seeing the man again with unclouded eyes, her body tensed. The glow from those yellow eyes pierced her, seeming to see right through to her core.
What?
She stammered. His demeanor softened, and he laid his hands on the table between them, weaving his long, bony fingers together, a bow and arrow tattooed on the back of one hand. His nails were yellowed and caked with a dark substance, dried and flaking off to the tabletop each time he moved them when he spoke.
You may call me Victor, but my real name has been known to you and your people for a long, long time. Myself and my associates were even mentioned in several popular religious texts and a multitude of fictional stories. I am one of 4. I am the one they call Conquest.
Amanda still sat in stunned silence. He cocked his head slightly to the right.
Surely you've heard of us. The most popular part of our story is the ending of this world. Myself, death, famine, and war. The names you people have provided for us have been granted the power to cause great suffering and destruction to the people of this world.
His eyes glowed brighter at the words, suffering and destruction. Amanda finally snapped out of her shocked daze and stared hard at Victor, narrowing her eyes. His calm demeanor and general appearance didn't mesh with any definition of hallucinations from extreme mental illness she'd heard of. But there had to be something. Something was wrong. No one as relatively normal looking as him would just sit down and claim to be one of the 4 horsemen. She inhaled deeply.
So,
she began, still slightly rattled but more collected now.
You expect me to believe that you're some magical being that has the power to destroy the world or some other nonsense?
He smiled and chuckled from beneath the darkness that still swallowed him up. Only the slightest glint of his teeth visible as evidence of the change.
Why, yes I do,
he replied. He held up one finger, stood up, and walked to a nearby table. He spread his hands out on the tabletop, his fingers bending with sickening cracking and splayed at angles they shouldn't have been able to bend. He started humming quietly, just one note, in a pattern she recognized. Time seemed to stretch on, as nothing seemed to happen. But then the table began to shake. No, vibrate beneath his hands. She could hear the quiet tapping of each of his long fingernails striking the wood tabletop as each digit began bouncing higher. Just each finger, though, not the entire hand. The area under his palms began to darken. The smell of burning wood filled the air as more and more of the wood charred as the heat radiated outward. Amanda glanced around quickly to see if anyone else had noticed, but the rest of the cafe was going about their business as normal. The burning smell became overpowering, and his humming grew louder, that rhythmic humming, and she could feel the heat begin to wash over her. The hum began to evolve into a growl, and his fingers began to vibrate faster and blur together. The growl grew louder, and soon he was yelling, screaming as the table below him burst into flames. It burned hot and bright, the fire growing until it reached the ceiling, scorching it. Smoke billowing out from the growing flames, filling the cafe. It burned in Amanda's lungs, and she leapt from her chair, making a mad dash for the door. But right as she twisted the handle, it all stopped, and there was silence. Just like the other visions. She glanced back over her shoulder, and there stood Victor, back by their original table, and sipping on her latte. He motioned to the chair she'd sat in just minutes before.
Come, sit. We have things to talk about.
Amanda hesitated, eyeing him suspiciously. How had he triggered another vision? She hadn't taken a sip of her coffee yet, so he couldn't have slipped her anything. She shook her head and walked slowly back to the table and sat down. He sat back down across from her.
Thank you. Now, as you've seen, I'm a bit more than the human I appeared to be. This is merely the form I chose to appear in, so that I can carry out my assignment.
Amanda eyed him through squinted lids.
And what might that be?
Again, the glint of a smile.
Why, to find the one to make the choice, of course. The choice of if the world ends or not.
Amanda chuckled lightly.
And that's me? I'm the one. Why would I be the one that decides such a massive thing as that?
Victor tapped his fingernails on the tabletop and cocked his head to one side.
Why not?
Amanda thought for a moment, then shook her head. This was ridiculous. She began to push back from the table, but Victor continued.
Every few thousand years, the four of us, my compatriots and I, would be charged with finding someone here in your world to make a choice. The choice of wherever the entire world would be almost completely destroyed, and then rise from the ashes like the proverbial phoenix. The world would have to start over, have to rebuild itself, piece by piece, from the charred remains of the destruction. It's surprisingly interesting to watch, but fortunately for this world, no one has ever said yes to our offer.
And what would that offer be?
She said sarcastically with a smirk.
Why, eternal life, of course. To be taken from this world, and no matter what happens, existing completely independent from everything here. You could come and go as you please, appear however you'd like, and be able to move through time as easily as you walk down those stairs from your apartment, or ordered that latte,
he said, pointing down to the now empty cup.
It'd be a shame to see the world end. That was actually rather delicious. Now, to the point at hand. What is your decision?
Amanda sat back in her chair.
What? Now? I have to decide right now.
He nodded.
That's the deal. We select the person, they have to choose. There is, of course, one last thing I forgot to mention. If you choose to let the world live on until the next time a choice has to be made, you will be completely erased. Not just in this moment, but from all time. You would have never existed.
She thought back to her childhood, how much her mother relied on her to even do the simplest of things sometimes. The ALS diagnosis had stunned the whole family and several doctors when she began to show the symptoms in her early 40s. Amanda had been just 18 then, and the days only became more and more of a struggle after that. Her father had left when she was just a toddler, so she was her mom's only caretaker. Then there was the whole new world of problems that came later with her mother's deteriorating mental state. Tears welled up in Amanda's eyes, imagining her mother dealing with the illness alone. Thought of what might happen if she wasn't there to call the ambulance when her mother had fallen down the stairs. She shook her head and reconnected with his golden gaze.
And will everyone be wiped out? Will any lives be spared?
She asked, thinking of her mother. Again, the glint of a smile.
Well, we make no guarantees. But if you do decide to take us up on our offer, we could make some arrangements that could try to help prevent certain lives from being lost. But we can't make any promises given how you people tend to act when chaos ensues.
Chaos. The word caught in Amanda's mind. She vaguely remembered reading somewhere that the experts had said that certain texts had talked about a fifth horseman, one more than the Christian Bible had mentioned. These other texts called them chaos. She thought again of her mother, her friends, the world. He tapped against the table with his fingernail impatiently, the sound bringing her back from being lost in thought. His demeanor had changed. There was no more smile, no more casual conversation. Victor was clearly annoyed. The temperature in the room began to rise as the table beneath his fingers began to brown. He leaned forward.
The longer you take, the more impatient I get. And let's just say you wouldn't like me very much when I'm angry.
He growled. His eyes flashed even brighter as he flexed his fingers, those dirty nails dragging across the tabletop, gouging it with deep scratches. Amanda panicked and started shaking as the reality finally hit. Her eyes darted around the room, looking at all the people around her. Could she really doom them to an excruciating death like the ones she'd seen in her visions? Or should she give up her own life just to save them all? Victor stood up from his chair quickly, grabbed it by the back and launched it across the room. The crash when it struck the wall was deafening. His eyes now glowed a fierce red, and fire licked his fingertips.
You must decide,
he snarled, his voice loud enough to echo off the walls. She cowered in her chair, shrinking back as his frame towered over her, and panic set in. Her mind raced, and her heart practically threatened to burst from her chest. He stepped closer to her, the heat from him searing her skin, the pain on her cheek, a reminder of another terrible time in her life. She touched the scar on her arm, paused only a moment, then finally said in a meek voice,
I've made my choice.
The heat instantly ceased, and the room began to cool. Victor stepped back and smiled. He nodded, tipped his hat slightly, and turned to leave. Then, the screaming started. Amanda squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears, a cacophony of pain surrounding her, the end of it all. Amanda was still cowering in her chair when the men from the hospital came into the cafe to get her. The only screams they heard were the ones coming from Amanda herself, between sobs and ranting about the end of the world. "Easy now, Amanda. We're just here to take you back to someplace safe," one of the men said while the other hooked his arms under hers, dragging her, kicking and screaming, out the door to the waiting ambulance. Thank you for listening to These Dark Spaces. We hope you enjoyed this story. You can find out more about us at thesedarkspaces.com or follow us on Twitter at thesedarkspaces. If you've enjoyed listening, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite listening platform. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, keep your senses sharp, and your mind open.